Thanks, Jeremy. Appreciate it. And just some remote meeting housekeeping, I guess. I will be watching the text chat as well during the course of the meeting here, but we're a nice small group, so please feel free to jump off of mute. If you have a question or pop something in the chat, either way is good for me. I'll see it. As Jeremy said, my name is John Peluso. I'm the CTO of AvePoint's North America public sector organization. I've been with AvePoint for, it will be 10 years in, oh good Lord, December. So it's been quite a clip. Some of my digits up here. Please feel free to stay connected. It's been an interesting time. People ask me where I'm from. My answer used to be row 8, usually row 8 on United, but it's been a while. I do spend quite a bit of time in Washington, D.C., obviously, with our public sector business, specifically the federal and DoD business. Keeps me in D.C. a lot of time. My home is at the Jersey Shore, the actual Jersey Shore. Yes, the one that was on TV, but unlike the one you saw on TV, this picture on the lower right is more of a normal everyday Jersey Shore picture. So pleasure to be with you all today. As Jeremy said, also we were looking for a topic, and this is an excerpt from a larger presentation that I do at some events that deals with really tearing apart external sharing in specifically in Office 365, but any discussion there will automatically force us to talk about some of the Azure technologies that sit behind it. So I call the talk layers of the onion because there are so many layers of settings and controls that make all this stuff work. And we'll get into that. We'll get into all of that today. So we'll talk a little bit about Azure AD B2B, business to business, which is the underlying technology for guest access in Office 365. We'll talk a little bit about how that impacts Teams, groups. We'll talk about how SharePoint and OneDrive are different, and because of the audience here, we will focus explicitly on what's available in the Microsoft government clouds, so GCC and GCC High. I've got a pretty interesting demo here. Environment. So we've got left hand, right hand. On the left side, we're going to see our GCC environment, which is here. And on the right side, we have a GCC High environment. So as we look at all these settings today, everything that you're seeing will be either GCC or GCC High, and I'll point to the differences as we go through. So with that as a precursor, let's have a little bit of discussion here. Anybody currently using external sharing in SharePoint or guest access in Teams now in Office 365? Eric's got his hand up. What's up, Eric? I guess that was I'm using it, huh? Good deal. Ted as well. Super. D, good. Jeremy as well. Awesome. Now they're coming out of the woodwork. Again, guys, please feel free to come off mute. I'm really not a fan of the sound of my own voice, so when it's only me bouncing back at me, it'll make for a long session here today. But good. So. Yeah,
I just wanted to point out I'm one of the DoD organizations that's rushing towards full Office 365, and so we haven't got a guest access right now because they're frantically trying to figure out how to create regular access. So.
Yep. And actually, I'll talk a little bit about DoD and GCC High. It's kind of an interesting situation because the guest access in groups and teams is not even an option right now in GCC High and DoD, but you do have this capability to do external sharing through SharePoint. And why that is and why those things aren't as connected as you would think they would be. Those are specifics that we will pull apart. We'll tug on that thread today. Cool. So, any discussion of guest access or external access, I notice in my conversations with some commercial organizations and with GCC organizations where all these capabilities are available today, there's usually a little bit of back and forth, right? Because there's fear that comes from the concept of guest access and external sharing in Office 365, which is, hey, I'm letting someone in. Once they're in, what can they do? How can I keep track of what they're doing? Just this concept of having someone from outside be able to collaborate in your day-to-day collaboration system is one that spooks some people. But the reality of the situation, and this is a conversation that I have quite a bit, is that you're already doing this, right? You are already collaborating externally every day. And you're doing it probably via email. I know internally with our key security stakeholders here at Outpoint, there's a constant, communication. And, there was concern around data storage, and there's concern around, do we have any contracts in place that say, that we've agreed to not allow this kind of communication or that kind of communication. And it is useful to pull back and say, well, we're already doing this today. We already have, customer information in our email, because if you don't let me, coordinate on a deployment over a team, let's say, that I share with an external, then it's going to happen through email. And so whether the information's in the email server or Exchange Online or in Teams, it's there, right? So the reality here is that, yes, fundamentally, you are already collaborating externally. Email is the way it's usually done, unless you've done something like you're using Box or a service that is more amenable to externals. If you're not using Office 365, you're either doing something like that, or you're doing probably a legacy SharePoint with the old VDash model. But this is a reality that everybody faces every day. The one thing, although I'm usually the one that takes a poke and constantly, puts people back to the concept of, you're already doing this, you're already emailing people, the information is already out there. There is something fundamentally different about external sharing in Office 365 versus email sharing externally. And that is, yes, absolutely. Email is much more open, in some ways harder to control. But the reality is externals in email only get what they are sent, right? Where the fear that, is something that you need to be aware of and pay attention to is externals in Office 365. Once they're in the directory, they can be added anywhere guests are allowed. And so that's some of the fear of creeping across the organization, right? Bob is not Bob that you think Bob's a different Bob. And so it's really easy to do this. But again, pushback is, how many of us have addressed an email to the wrong Bob, right, and sent them something? So I usually play the part here because normally I find that there's a need to push people in the direction of thinking about opening up this external sharing as a more structured and manageable way to collaborate externally. And so I find myself pushing for it in most organizations, but be aware that there are some things that you'll get back. Anybody have any strong opinions on this one? Obviously, most of us on the call, I think, recognize the value of this kind of external sharing, but anybody have any thoughts or opinions on this one before we move on?
Yeah, hi, this is Dee. So I think, for us, it's like we're kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out, because for cross collaboration, it's an excellent way to communicate with everything that's going on with COVID-19. Mm-hmm. However, to your point, you have to think about the security part of it too. So then you have to say, well, do they really need access to everything? Like if we had them, can we just give them to the SharePoint side and just add what parts that way? So it's really, it's in the middle for a lot of organizations, because from an agency perspective, like, being in Northern Virginia, we communicate with everybody in basically the DMV area. So with that, it's like you want the cross collaboration, but then at the same time, you have to be mindful. Well, it's not just those, like, what about other organizations? Because then they're going to say, well, why can't we do it for this? Or why can't we do it for these contractors or vendors? So it's just kind of finding like that middle ground.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I think those are great points. Anyone else? Okay. So the good news here is that, and Dee brought up a good point, right? Why do we have to think in these broad on-off terms, right? What is available for us to maybe tune this external collaboration? The good news, and the reason we're calling this talk "The Layers of the Onion" is because there are many, many, many layers that you're going to be dealing with. The joke here is like an onion. If we do this wrong, it can, cause quite a bit of challenge and problem. Something I noticed recently, I'm not sure about DoD, and obviously GCC High and DoD have some limitations when it comes to external sharing currently, but certainly in GCC and in Office 365 Commercial, sometime in 2019, Microsoft started shipping every new Office 365 tenant, external sharing and guest access was on by default. I used to do this talk and say, well, at least Microsoft released off by default for guest access, but it is now on by default, which is pretty interesting when you think about it. Now, let's start to take a look at the technology because you may do like I did. So a couple of years ago, when I started looking at this, I said, all right, let me poke around and let me find out all these different things. And here's a setting that we'll talk about. This is an Azure AD setting that looks like it has to do with external sharing. There's this interface here, which seems to have to do with external sharing. This is in the SharePoint Admin Center. And then we've got this setting, which is in the Office 365 Admin Center. And then there's this setting over here, which is also the Office 365 Admin Center, but this is under security and privacy. And then there's an external sharing setting here, again, Microsoft 365 Admin Center, Office 365 group settings. Then there's these settings here when you're trying to share a site, right? I'm being told my organization policies don't allow me to share with this person. And then there's this setting here in the SharePoint Admin Center when I'm looking at a particular site. And then there's this setting here, which is in the SharePoint Admin Center. It's more of a global SharePoint setting. And then there's this setting here. So there's quite a bit, and they pile on. Oh, here's Teams. There's some external sharing. So what in the heck am I supposed to configure? How do these settings all relate to each other? And that slide was actually a fun exercise. That was me going through the different interfaces where I saw references to guest access and external sharing in Office 365, and none of those screenshots were actually duplicates of each other. So how these things all fit together is really, really crazy. And that's what we'll talk about in the rest of the session here. What I wanted to start with is the core of all of this is Azure Active Directory B2B. Now, don't look for a technology in your interfaces called Azure Active Directory B2B. You won't find B2B in the Azure portal because it's more of an underlying technology than anything else, right? It'll be called external identities right now in GCC is what it's called. Organizational relationships is what it's called in GCC High. And, tune in next week, it'll be called something else. But really, at the end of the day, the technology is built off of Azure Active Directory B2B. So let's talk a little bit about the model that many of us used in the past to collaborate externally. This was a common practice. I know, having a long background in SharePoint, this is a really common way that people would involve external users in their on-prem SharePoint sites. It's the old V- model, right? So what's the V- model? V- model is I've got my external party I want to collaborate with, in this case, user B, who's sitting in this Fabricam organization. Me and my content are here in the Contoso organization, and I need to collaborate with my Fabricam buddy. So what we would do is we would go ahead and in the Contoso directory, we would create an account for this user. I'd give him a username, I give him a password, right? Probably I would have user A send them the username and password credential information, and now I've got this user in my directory. But in a standard Active Directory, there's no way to tell the difference between user A and user B, right? Using just the out-of-box stuff. So what we would do is we would give this guy a special name, V-something, right? Especially in DoD and Fed civilian, we see a lot of folks that have naming conventions to indicate whether someone's a member of the government or whether they're a part of a contracting organization or something like that, right? But this is the old V- model where I actually create user B in my directory, and that's how he or she gains access to the content. The downside of this approach is that there really is no connection in this case between the external user in their organization and that external user in my organization. So we're subject to some challenging things. For example, let's say user B does something unscrupulous, gets fired. I don't know that, right? There's no connection between the original user B and the one I created in my directory. This guy shifts roles, this guy shifts organizations, gets fired, what have you. I have to know to change that here, right? Another more common way to collaborate is the old email collaboration method, which I think we all understand the downsides of. I don't have access or control of the content. At least in this model, I still owned the content and I had control of the content. With the email-based model, things are getting a little bit better with things like Azure Information Protection and the new unified labeling and Microsoft Information Protection that's in GCC and coming to GCC High and DoD. But still, you know, there's this challenge of number one, I don't really have co-authoring here. I don't have any of the really modern collaboration techniques. And again, this is all based off of sending information out of the organization, which is a challenge as well. All right. So if those are the problems that we're trying to solve, and the old school methods of identity in this kind of external collaboration model, what is Azure AD B2B, right? What the difference in Azure AD B2B is that I take the best of what I had before. I have user B as a member of my directory, and I'm able to collaborate with them, modern collaboration, directly in whatever services I choose to allow them. Maybe it's SharePoint, maybe it's Teams, maybe it's groups. The difference, though, is that this is not a user that I add to my directory as a standard user, right? It's not a full-fledged user. Azure AD allows us to create what are called guest users, and a guest user is not an identity, right? It's a reference to an external identity. So user B here really is this user B in Fabricam, right? When user B wants to log into my Office 365 and get access to content, he or she first has to go here and authenticate back in Fabricam. If user B no longer exists in Fabricam, obviously they will not be able to authenticate, and therefore they will no longer have access to my content, right? Another thing that's cool here is because the user will always be referred back to their originating organization, this gives me the ability to set up, allow, and deny lists of domains that I want to be able to participate with as guests. And so that's the fundamental difference. Other than that, things work pretty much the same. Because user B here is not a full-fledged internal user, they are a special type of user called a guest user. I can also set policies that know that user B is a guest. You'll see settings in Teams, settings in groups, etc., that determine what guests can do versus what standard users can do. So we have that as well. We have that additional control. All right, let's pause there. Any questions on Azure AD B2B as a fundamental here? Is there an allow deny for my users becoming a guest of a different tenant? That's a great question, Eric. And it is one that comes in all the time. One of the biggest challenges that I've heard in this scenario is exactly that. I have a lot of control about how to control guests that are in my tenant. I don't have a lot of control about what my users can do as guests in other tenants. There are a couple of Azure technologies that are starting to spawn up here, and I'll cover those when we get into the demo, that would potentially allow things like an approver on the external side that would have to approve before one of their identities could be added to my tenant, but that is in a very, very isolated case if you're using the entitlement management capabilities of Azure's identity governance, right? In most cases, in most scenarios, you don't really have much control about what a user in your tenant can do as far as being a guest in another location. Is there a way to auto? Yeah, it's a good one, D. Is there a way to auto disable a guest after a period of time or based on activity? The short answer is no, with an asterisk, right? No with an asterisk, at least no automated way to do this. You can do things in SharePoint like having external links that expire, but nothing as far as getting a user out of the directory. We actually built that in one of the AvePoint tool sets because it is such a big hole and it's such a big thing that that folks are asking for. So native without third party, there is no capability there. D, that's our cloud governance, AvePoint cloud governance product. So happy to talk about that offline with you if you want, but don't really want to. I don't want to vendor this one up too much. So Jason mentioned conditional access. What's the cool thing about Azure being the foundation for this external sharing? It's all of the goodies that you get with Azure in terms of identity management, you now can enforce for your guests. So yeah, conditional access, things like multi-factor. You can do all of these things because of the power of the identity management that you get in Azure. So conditional access, you can do, as I mentioned, multi-factor. Internally here at AvePoint, we're using conditional access to pop up a terms and conditions that people see when they log in if they're guests, right? So there's a lot of cool things that you can do because we're building off on Azure. Of course, we'll get into licensing. You can only use the cool bits that you're licensed to use. So if you have internal licensing that allow for conditional access, for example, if you have Azure AD P1, which is the minimum for conditional access policies, you can use those for your guests as well, right? You just need the right licensing. We'll get into that, but there's a few core settings on the Azure side. Mostly about how to control guests and how guests are added. So we'll cover all these when I pop out to the demo. But at this level, we can do things like limit guest permissions. What does guest limited permissions mean? Basically, it's about can they traverse the directory? Can they browse and query the directory? Or are they limited to just seeing the internal users for that they interact with? So let's take a Teams example. If guest permission limited is set to yes, and I'm in Teams, I will only be able to search the directory for people who are part of groups and teams I'm also a member of. I won't be able to traverse outside that. So for example, I am an external member of a number of Microsoft teams, but I am not going to be able to go ahead into that external team, go to chat and start a chat with Satya, right? That's not going to work. The question from Jason, just so we're clear on the B2B, this is gov to gov only, not gov to com. Actually, GCC will allow gov to commercial. GCC High, as we will see, and DoD will only allow collaboration with folks in the same government cloud as your tenant. The long-term vision, though, is collaboration with anyone. So right now, there's a limitation in GCC High, as you'll see in a demo that I do. But the long-term vision, I think, is to allow for collaboration across different clouds from a single tenant. We have a lot of folks that we talk to that potentially have both a GCC and a GCC High tenant, because they need to sometimes collaborate with people on the high side and sometimes need to collaborate with people even down in commercial. So correct, Jason, right now, if you're high or DoD, you will only be able to collaborate with people in those clouds. We'll see how that evolves over time. Admins can invite guests, yes or no, right? Members can invite, yes or no. Members can invite, with respect to groups and teams, right? This is the setting that determines if your team and group owners are allowed to invite people, yes or no. No means all guests will have to be invited by an admin. Yes means, depending upon the settings that you'll see down below, if those switches are also flicked on, then you may have a situation where team owners, group owners can add guests or can invite guests into the directory. Guests can invite, usually set to no, because you don't want guests inviting other guests unless you have a pretty particular scenario there. Licensing wise, I mentioned licensing before. Remember the magic ratio, 5:1. The magic ratio is 5:1. Both with Azure licensing as well as with Office 365 licensing, you have a 5:1 ratio of guests who wouldn't require a license for each one paid license that you have. Example, I want to use conditional access, so I need Azure AD P1. I think I'm going to have 50 guests, right? So I need enough licensing to cover 50 guests at a 5:1 ratio. That means I need at least 10 paid Azure AD P1 licenses. Office 365 works the same way. I don't have to license, you don't actually apply the license. You just need in quantity for the tenant at least one Office 365 license for every 5 guests you want to invite. So the licensing is pretty liberal here. And that opens up a lot of cool scenarios. I mentioned at a point we have like a pop-up we want to put up there with terms and conditions when we have external users. Obviously, that's going to require P1 licensing, but we don't need to license every AvePoint person in the tenant with an Azure AD P1. I just need enough P1s to cover the 5:1 ratio for the guests that we believe we're going to have, right? Any questions on this licensing model here? Okay, cool. So let's get into it. And let me pop up again, left side, right side. On my taskbar, they're actually the opposite. So let me change that. Okay, so left side, right side. We've got on the left side here is GCC, right? And then on the right side here, this is a GCC High tenant. Unfortunately, I don't have a DoD tenant for us to look at, but we'll see the difference left to right. Okay, so over here in Azure Active Directory, you can see in the GCC side, we've got this thing called external identities. I swear that used to be called organizational relationships not long ago. And over here on the GCC High side, it is still called organizational relationships. So we'll click over there. And then what we're going to do is take a look at the settings. So over here on the GCC side, it's external collaboration settings. Over here on the GCC High side right now, it's just settings. Here's those switches that we looked at before, and I'll explain why there's more on the GCC side than on the GCC High side. But essentially, these first 4 sliders are exactly the same, right? Guest user permissions are limited. This is, can they traverse the directory or not? Admins and users in the guest inviter role can invite, right? The guest inviter role is an Azure Active Directory role, right? This has nothing to do with Office 365. This is an Azure AD role that you can give. If I flick this to no, right, then until it's changed, no one can invite external guests. This is as close as you get to an actual off switch in GCC, I'm sorry, in Office, in Azure AD, right, for external sharing. right? So can admins add guests? Yes. I'm going to save this so that it doesn't screw up the rest of our demo. Members can invite. Now we're getting into a setting that would impact Office 365. Again, members can invite. Would be, am I restricting the invitation of guests to just admins or not? Yes or no. In this case, members can invite is set to on because I do want to open up scenarios where folks can invite their own guests and not bother me in IT. Now, again, there are many layers down the chain, as we will see, that would have to be set to determine how and if an owner can actually add a user to a team, let's say. But if I want to make sure it can never happen, I just flick these to off, right? And so again, knowing that all these ship on by default, one of the things you may want to do is until you design that strategy for how you're going to control guest access, might want to go ahead and flick these to no. What that would do is stop owners from being able to invite until you have a plan in place, at which point you can flick it back on if you want. What we're doing actually at AvePoint is these are set to no because we use an alternate process to onboard a guest. Again, we use our own software for that, so we don't use the native Azure AD member invite model, right? So in that case, we have these set to no. But for the sake of our demo, we'll leave these on because it's the only way that you have to have it if you want to use the native invitation flow. Guests can invite. No, I don't want my guests inviting other guests, right? Now, let's skip these next two settings in GCC and just go to one of these ones at the bottom. Here are our allow, deny kind of settings in terms of domains. So as this is out of the box, any domain can be set here, right on both sides. Here's where I could put a deny. So I can list a set of domains with deny. And this is how I could be more restrictive and say only allow collaboration with people of these domains. So if you want a real manageable external collaboration strategy, you've got a few agencies, maybe a few partner organizations that you do business with outside your own tenant, you could just go in, use the allow only, set up those few domains. Now, you can't control automatically beyond this which people from these domains get invited, but at minimum, you're ensuring that the only external invites that can go out will be to these domains. Any questions on these Azure AD settings? D.
Yeah, I had a quick question. So with the only allow, does that mean that no other domain would be allowed?
Correct. Yeah, correct. You'll see settings that look a little bit like this later in SharePoint, and I'll talk about why. But yeah, the way this allow only works is the only domains that can be can get a guest invite is folks in this domain. So for example, let's go here and put avepoint.com in here. There we go. Right, and I'll save that settings. All right, so now the only guests that are allowed here are guests from AvePoint. If I were to come over here and propose a new guest user, John Gmail, no spam, please. You can see that the organization settings don't allow me to collaborate with that particular user because of domain. And this message will appear in Teams, will appear in other places if I tried to invite John. So let me go ahead and, again, this is Teams. I'm skipping ahead a little bit here, but here are my Teams. Oh, that's Teams Admin Center. That's not what I wanted. I want actual Teams. Leslie, good question. Does that apply to sharing files from OneDrive, SharePoint, and Teams? Hold the line. I will get into that very quickly here. The short answer is it depends, as you know, it's an answer that you'll normally hear from a consultant, right? So let's go ahead and see if we can't add a member. Let's try to add John at Gmail. I bet you Teams guest access is not turned on. Again, skipping ahead a little bit for you. Oh, it is on. Okay, good. All right, we'll get into that. But basically, that same message that you saw about restricting John from being able to be added is one that you'll see in the lower level applications as well, right? So that's what my Azure AD settings do. This will definitely affect Teams, whether Teams can have guests. This will definitely impact whether Office 365 groups and group connected sites can have guests. So let's go off to see how those two applications, groups and Teams, go ahead and leverage this technology, and then we'll come around the other side and talk about SharePoint and OneDrive specifically. Remember, Azure AD B2B is an Azure technology. So other Office 365 services built off of Azure technologies, groups and teams, right? Why groups and teams? Because the foundational element of a group or a team is an Office 365 group, which is an Azure AD object. So groups and teams and their membership will follow these rules, okay? All right, I'm going to come back here for this one-time passcode thing. So we'll skip that. Notice that it's not in the GCC High, but we'll come back later after we talk about SharePoint for this one-time passcode thing. All right, good. Any final questions on the Azure AD stuff before we move along? Okay, so let's get into this. If we think again about these settings as an onion, we just went into Azure AD, right? And there's a lot of settings there. So we manipulated domains, whether members could invite or not. What we need to do is now go to 3 more layers, right? So if we want to, if the goal is external sharing or guest access in Teams, there's actually 4 layers of settings that we've got to navigate. The first is Azure AD. The second is Office 365 security and privacy, which is a setting that an Office 365 admin can flick. Then there's settings for groups, right, in Office 365 groups, and then there's settings in Teams. So let's find our way down. We already looked at Azure AD. This is the setting at the next layer, which is, again, organizational settings, security and privacy. Notice that this is simply asking or allowing you to set whether guests can be invited by owners, right? Remember the members can invite tick box in Azure, right? If that is enabled, this is a next level down tick box that says in Office 365, remember, we were just looking at Azure. Many different services use Azure, Office 365 just being one of them. This setting is, okay, if members can invite is on in Azure AD, do we also want to let owners invite people in the Office 365 services? If this tick box is set to off, right, what you've now done is said owners will never be able to add new guests. They will always have to be invited by an IT admin or an admin, Azure admin with the guest inviter role. Okay. Next setting, groups. Now I'm in same thing, my admin center for Office 365, but now I'm down here at settings, org settings, services, Office 365 groups. And here's my manage external sharing setting. Let group members outside your organization access group content. Translation, are guests allowed in groups, yes or no? If this tick box is off, guests will not be allowed in groups and by extension, not be allowed in Teams, right? So if you have this tick box on, what you could also do is another setting that looks exactly the same as the one we just looked at, which is let group owners add people outside your organization. So what's the relationship? This is tenant-wide, right? For all applications in the tenant, will I allow invites to come from essentially non-admins or owners, right? If that's on, I have another setting here just at the groups level. Do I want to allow owners to add, right? If these two tick boxes are on, and if this tick box is on, and if the members can invite slider is set to on for Azure AD, what that means is all groups can have guests, and group owners are the ones that can decide if a new guest needs to be added, right? So that's pretty open. How do I control this? My best way to control it is those domain restrictions at Azure AD, right? So this is pretty wide open, guests and groups, right? And my only real control here is obviously the allowed deny list and in Azure AD for domains, as well as any conditional access policies that may be set up. So let me pause there for groups. Any questions on that stuff?
I just want to confirm, it's D. So if I select let the group owners add people outside of the organization, will that restrict any other members of the group? And is that just for that group, or like how does that?
Yeah, this is a great question. First off, let's be clear, right? We're in the admin center. So what I set here by default will apply to all groups. This is a global setting for groups within the tenant. So if I say let them have guests and well, if I say let them have guests, that means guests are allowed in every group, right? There is no more granular tick box, group by group, team by team, right? Only this one that affects all. Now there is a setting under the hood. There is a setting that you can apply at the group and team level, but it's only available via either PowerShell or API. So you're either going to go third-party application, or you're going to need to do some scripting. And in that case, what you would do is leave this on. This is another weird thing about guest access in Office 365. In general, you would think lock it down and then open it up only where you need it. It works the reverse, right? We have to have it wide open globally, and then we can tie it down group by group using that PowerShell or API method, right? So for example, in our Teams provisioning service, that we built into our platform, there is a setting that says for this group, should I allow guests or not, right? What we're doing there is simply using that same mechanism. This has to be on for the tenant for guests to be allowed anywhere. And then as we provision teams or import teams, we will flick that hidden sort of toggle group by group, team by team to say whether or not they will allow guests. And the second one here, again, owners can add, applies to all groups. Right. Does that answer that question, Dee?
Yes.
Okay. Anybody confused yet? There's a lot of layers. We're not done. Let's say we want folks in teams. We can still do that, right? There's one more slider that we have to turn on, which would be the slider to allow guests in teams, yes or no. Up to now, everything we've been doing has been, if you follow it, Azure AD, Office 365 Tenant, groups, now finally teams. If I flick this on, there's nothing more to set. The owners can invite yes, no, honors the settings that you had back here, because again, teams are groups. And then what I can do is have some additional settings for what guests are allowed to do in teams if they gain access, right? As I mentioned, and I'll, Jeremy, we'll figure out how to get this presentation out to folks after the session. But this is that some description on that group by group, team by team PowerShell that you can use. Essentially what you're doing is creating a settings template and then applying that settings template to specific groups and teams. Whereas newly created groups and teams will inherit the default, which is guests are allowed, and then this will lock down teams and groups that you apply these settings to. When it comes to what can guests do in teams, right? They're pretty full featured in terms of, you know, the day-to-day collaboration. They can participate in channel conversations. They can post and delete messages. They can share files. The one caveat in chat is that guests in your tenant don't have a mailbox and they don't have a OneDrive, which means if we know under the hood how one-to-one chats work in Teams, we know that files that are shared go into the OneDrive of the user that posted the file. By extension, because those guests don't have a OneDrive, they can't post their own files. They can collaborate on files you post because those files go into your OneDrive and get shared with those guests, but they can't post their own files. If it's a channel and a team, they can absolutely post files because remember, in a team conversation, the files go into the SharePoint site for the team. So just a little caveat about the non-team chats. Depending upon the settings in the team, guests may or may not be able to create a channel, right? And depending upon how we set up Office 365, they may or may not be able to invite guests themselves. But guests can't create teams and meetings. They can't discover and join public teams. Why? Because they cannot traverse the directory. They can't share files over chat, which we mentioned. There's some things that they can't do as far as apps and so forth, and things that you would expect a guest to not be able to do. But on the whole, it's a pretty full-featured experience. Be very careful about terminology. When we get into guests, when we get into the team settings in our demo in a couple of minutes here, we'll see that there is something called guest access, but then there's a separate setting called external access in Teams. External access in Teams is your modern version of the old Skype federation, right? So quote unquote external access, right? And you got to be real careful about this terminology. We use the term guest and external pretty freely. When you're talking about Teams admin settings, it makes a big difference. External access is just chat federation. It only allows people to participate in chats, right? And that's those settings there. What you really want, if you want, you know, first class sort of collaboration for Teams, is guest access. All right, so let's go off and take a little bit of a look at this. And again, we'll come over here. So the first thing let's do is let's go ahead into my GCC tenant. Is my monitor too small for you guys? Should I maximize the one I'm working on, or is this side to side okay?
It's a little small.
Okay, we can solve that problem.
Thank you.
Any better?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So let's go ahead and let's go to the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. And I'm down here in org settings because the first thing that I need to do is come up here to security and privacy. And I need to make sure that my sharing settings are set properly. So this is that toggle that allows, that says whether or not owners can add people to the directory or can invite people to the directory or not, right? So this is, are you going to allow the standard out-of-box owner invitation flow, yes or no? Even if you deselect this box, you still can have guests in those groups and teams. It's just that your owners will not be able to invite new guests, right? That's what that setting is. So that's the tenant-wide sharing setting. And now what I'm going to do is actually come over here to services, and we're going to look at Microsoft 365 groups. And here are those two toggles, right? Let group members outside your organization access group content. If this were off, I would not be allowed to add guests to any groups, right? New guests or existing guests, right? This second toggle is only about invitation of net new guests. So can guests participate in groups? Yes or no? Can new guests be invited by an owner? Yes or no? Right, that's my Microsoft 365 group settings. And then finally, I have my Teams Admin Center. And here's my final layer of Teams settings. Notice external access and guest access are two different things, right? Don't be fooled. This is your Skype federation. This is what you want. Now, remember, I wasn't allowed to add John from Gmail. Why? Because right now, guest access in Teams is set to off. Even though it's on all the other way down, right now, I'm not allowed to add a guest to a team. So right now, I'm going to flick that to on. And now I have some settings about what guests can do, right? So do I allow them to share their screen? Do I allow them to initiate a meet now, right? Do I allow them to use these various messaging elements and so forth and so on, right? So I'm going to go ahead and click save. It says it needs a couple of hours to enable that change. So you won't be able to see me do this right now. And as Microsoft has been sort of scaling their service in this time of surge, some of these settings do take a bit of time to apply, but let's just see. Okay, it's going to take a while to apply. Again, remember, what this means here is just are guests allowed in Teams at all, yes or no, right? This has got nothing to do with inviting new guests. If I want to control the invitation of new guests to Teams, where do I do it? You got it. I do it back here using this setting in groups, right? Or if I want to shut it down across the whole tenant, right, I could shut it down over here and not allow owners to invite. Now, there was a question before about SharePoint. While we're here, let's actually look down at the SharePoint settings. This will be a good transition to our next point where we're going to talk about SharePoint. But notice that SharePoint has its own settings here. If I deselect any kind of sharing outside the organization here, I get a message that seems a little bit weird to me, right? Microsoft 365 settings let people outside the organization group access group content. These guests will receive an error if they try to access SharePoint content. So if I were to save these changes, what that would mean is guests would be allowed to be members of those Office 365 groups, given the settings that I've just set, but they wouldn't be able to access the SharePoint site. So basically, they'd only be able to participate in chat and conversations, but they couldn't access any files. So that's a weird discrepancy there that we'll talk about in a minute. You get a similar message back here under groups. If you don't select this, guests will be listed as members of the groups, but they won't receive group emails or be able to access any group content. They'll only be able to access files that were directly shared with them. So there's some weird thing going on, right, between SharePoint and groups. So let's go figure out what it is. Now, remember, the title of this session was Layers of the Onion. And the reason I call the SharePoint and OneDrive the shallots is that because they're kind of the same, but they're not really the same. By the way, I hope it's a little early for this screenshot here, this picture. I Googled red-headed stepchild, and this is the first picture that came up. But yeah, SharePoint and OneDrive are a little bit different. Remember, SharePoint and OneDrive had an external sharing construct before Azure AD B2B existed. So they don't rely on the same mechanism for external sharing that we've been using all the way through this presentation. You can force SharePoint to work that way, but it is not the default. So let's dig into that a little bit, right? So external sharing in SharePoint is not built on Azure AD B2B. Indications are that Microsoft is trying to sort of pull it into the fray, so it's not quite so confusing. But you will see a lot of duplicated settings. For example, that allow deny domain list doesn't dictate allow deny domains for SharePoint and OneDrive sharing, right? So you'd have to go create those same entries in the SharePoint side of the fence. So back to the question that was asked a while ago by Leslie. Leslie, no, those settings that we had set up don't by default impact SharePoint and OneDrive sharing. There is a technology, and you saw a peek of it in the GCC Admin Center, called one-time passcode. So one-time passcode, or OTP, is one way that forces Office 365, or rather SharePoint external sharing to use the directory, right? But for the most part, when external sharing happens in Office 365 using the SharePoint methods, SharePoint and OneDrive native methods, users do not get added to the directory, because that's not really what I'm doing. I'm adding them to the SharePoint site, but not to the directory, right? It's a separate construct. Now, what kind of control do we have? Understanding that it's a separate construct, we do have the ability to control what kind of external users can be shared with in a site collection, because these settings are site collection by site collection, right? Also, these settings exist for standalone SharePoint sites, but remember, the SharePoint sites that are backing groups and teams are both part of a group, but also live by SharePoint rules. So there's 2 layers of settings for every group and team, the SharePoint specific ones and the guest access settings. That's why in scenarios, a lot of times I'll say to a customer, you want to share externally, you want to collaborate. There's the collaboration that can happen by adding people to members of the teams, right? Which means they can participate in all the non-file related activity. And as long as SharePoint is allowing external users, they can use that membership to collaborate on SharePoint files. The other way you can go is say, I don't want to add an external to a member of a team, but I do want to share maybe some documents or a folder with them. In that case, I would use the SharePoint explicit external sharing. So we can control what kind of externals are allowed, right? We can control what can be shared externally, and we can set different settings as far as links that allow for sharing. These are the basic settings that you saw when we visited the SharePoint part of the services settings in the Office 365 Admin Center, right? Anyone is anyone, right? Anyone will allow, by the way, anonymous links. It's a very, very risky thing here. I mentioned previously that in GCC High, while we do have Azure AD B2B, we don't have the ability to do groups and teams. Let me go to those same settings that we've just been playing with for Azure AD on the GCC High side. Right? So we had all of our external settings here, but when I go to the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, I do have the security and privacy setting here, right? Why? Because there are some services in GCC High that allow external sharing. So again, are guests allowed in the organization? Yes, no. But when I go to that groups and teams section, I don't have the ability for groups to contain guests, right? And when I go over to my Teams Admin Center, when I go to my Teams Admin Center, notice I don't even have an external setting here, nowhere. I have external settings for federation, but no guest access settings, right? So this is why we can't have guests in groups and teams in GCC High. However, when I come over here to the org settings and I go to SharePoint, no settings there. Interesting. I can actually share externally in SharePoint. So here I am, GCC High, policies, sharing. Here, what did we set up here? Hang on a second. Guess, yes. Okay. Where am I? There I am. Good. Okay. So let me go ahead and save this. Sorry, guys, just resetting the demo environment here. This is what you'll see a lot in GCC High. They don't actually get rid of settings, but oftentimes you'll go visit a setting and it just won't be something that you can execute on. Yeah, it looks like this is not working for me right now. Anyway, okay, so SharePoint external sharing allowed, yes, no, you'll see these various settings. Be very careful about anyone. Anyone allows anonymous links. Anonymous links allow you to allow users to generate a link that does not even require sign-in, right? So you don't even know who's going to be using that link. New and existing guests would allow an invite to a net new guest or to leverage a guest already in the directory. Existing guests only will only allow sharing with guests that are already part of Azure AD. I said that SharePoint and OneDrive use a different sharing model than groups and teams because the construct of guests doesn't leverage B2B. Selecting this option forces SharePoint to use Azure AD B2B. Why? Because you'll only be able to externally share with people already in the directory, so which means you'll always have to follow those rules that are set in Azure AD. This is the setting that forces SharePoint and OneDrive to behave according to the Azure AD B2B rules that you've set up, right? And just to belabor the point, anything you set here for SharePoint also impacts OneDrive's. Okay, now we see the same settings again, now this time in the SharePoint Admin Center. Why? These are my settings globally across all of SharePoint and OneDrive. These are settings, and by the way, this, because it's a SharePoint, this is a setting in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, meaning who sets this setting? An admin of Office 365. So a global admin sets this setting here and says the most permissive I will allow is, and then they select one of these. A similar setting exists here in the SharePoint Admin Center. Why? Because now this is in the domain of a SharePoint admin. A SharePoint admin could say, hey, look, I know the global admin is going to allow guest access in SharePoint, but I am not. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this all the way down, right? In which case, it doesn't matter what was set at the level above. Now I have a more restrictive setting. That's the way, again, it works is it's got to be open up top for you to have it be more filtered down as you get closer to the objects themselves. Notice also you have a slider for SharePoint and you have a slider for OneDrive, right? Your slider for OneDrive can't be more permissive than your slider for SharePoint, right? It can be less, but it can't be more. Also, limit external sharing by domain. That looks like a duplicate, right? Why is that a duplicate? Because, again, if I'm going to allow any new guests, that new guest invitation flow is not going to go through Azure AD. It's going to go through SharePoint and its external invitation flow. So I would have to go ahead and set those domain settings here as well. It's really, really goofy. How do I overcome some of this? I overcome it by forcing SharePoint external sharing to work for existing guests only. The downside of that is you either have to put in some kind of guest onboarding workflow through some application, or, you know, again, as I was mentioning, this is something that we recently added in our software, or you have to rely on kind of operations and ticket systems to petition for a new guest user. If the site that you want to invite someone to is a group connected site, then important to note that you don't necessarily have to use the SharePoint external sharing model. If it's a group connected SharePoint site, whether because it's a team site or because it's just a group connected site without a team, you can just use the teams and groups guest access model. You don't have to mess around with this, right? This would be if I want to give guests access explicitly to SharePoint files and folders. All right, now we're one level down. I'm in the SharePoint Admin Center and I'm at the sites, active sites list. Now, site by site, I have the same settings. Okay, why? Because these settings now impact only this team. This will begin at the default settings that I set back here, but here's where I could tune it down even further. Okay, so let's take a quick look at that. Let's take a look here. This is my GCC tenant. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to the SharePoint Admin Center. And I'm going to go to Policies, Sharing. Here are those sliders that we talked about. Watch as I drag SharePoint down. It drags OneDrive down. If I wanted to, I could be extremely permissive in SharePoint, but not allow any guest access in OneDrive. So that's one thing that I could do. I could never have a setting for OneDrive that is more permissive than SharePoint, right? Microsoft just locks you to that. Again, be very careful about these ability for anonymous guest links. Speaking of which, right? Here are some external sharing settings. I can limit by domain. If I limit by domain, but I allow anyone, I can still bypass that because a user can create an anonymous link that bypasses this because they don't have to log in. So we probably don't want it up that high, right? Notice my avpoint.com domain is not here because this is a different domain allow deny construct. Let's go ahead and say I'm going to block Fabricam. Okay, blocking Fabricam. There you go. And some additional settings there. Now, if I go up to my sites list and my active sites, I'll see sharing settings here as well. Here's this 213 site sharing, and again, I see that that setting. So, who can content be shared with? Right, by default, looks like someone has already made an adjustment here. Let's see if we can find just a standard one here. Here, let's go here and deselect that one. Go to sharing. Did I save my changes there? I don't know. But anyway, you can see the settings, and I can have distinct settings here, right? These settings can be different than the organization level settings, and I can also, if I wanted to, reset so that this particular site follows and inherits the organization settings, which would have been the default. Looks like people have been messing around in here. All right, so remember, Office 365 leverages Azure AD B2B. Azure AD B2B is the basis for any Azure related technology, groups and teams being based on Active Directory groups called Office 365 groups or unified groups will inherit that model. SharePoint, OneDrive have their own construct, right? And depending upon how you set it, right, they may or they may not, follow the B2B model. If I set it to this, then it's the most connected I can have it to B2B. If I allow new guests here, all bets are off, and now I'm relying on settings here. Make sense? What other downside? Well, it's complicated because it's complicated. With flexibility comes complication. There's really nothing you could do about that. Now, the current model for how do I report? It's easy to report guest users in Azure AD because I just go to Azure AD and I have a section over here, right? If I go to Azure AD and I look at groups, right? Or if I go to users rather, I have the ability to just look at my external users, right? These are my guests. Users will only show up here after their invitation has been accepted, right? Which is what you're being told up here. But you can very easily see your guests here, and you can very easily in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center see your guest users here. It's not super easy to find out what they belong to, but at least you get some information. With SharePoint, if you're using the SharePoint external sharing construct, meaning you're not doing this through groups and teams, it's a little bit more difficult because unless you're relying on people in the directory or you're using the one-time passcode, guests added through SharePoint do not go into the directory, right? What you'd have to do there is go site by site, right? Site collection by site collection, and you'd have to run the reports, guest user reports, right? And those reports would surface up your guests, and that's site by site. Bottom line, recommendation, absolutely consider using users already in the directory to try to keep things centralized. Otherwise, you're going to have a little bit of a mess on your hands. Now, GCC High does not have the groups and teams model today. They only have the SharePoint model. So what I showed you for SharePoint works in GCC High and DoD today. But be careful, right? Be careful because it is possible, especially in GCC High, to set even anonymous links as possible. So just because it's GCC High, recommendation would be think twice, 3 times, 4 times before you're enabling those SharePoint external sharing settings. And if you are, definitely be wary of setting it to that highest and most permissive level. Longer term, of course, Microsoft is going to bring the guest and team sharing capabilities into the GCC High and DoD clouds, but we're not there yet. Key takeaways: many interfaces because there are many layers. Again, this is the flexibility. Do not get thrown off by what seem to be duplication of settings. Remember, these are layers, right? And that's why there's so many of the same setting, because we're going down, 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 closest to the application itself, in some cases closest to the team, group, or site itself. Don't start poking around if you have a demo tenant and get thrown off because you don't see changes immediately. Some of these settings do take a while to apply. My general rule is make your configuration come back the next day. It could take up to 24 hours in some cases for these settings to apply. So don't get thrown off by that. And then finally, again, can't stress it enough, think about limiting SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business to be users already in the directory. Of course, in that case, you'd have to come up with a model for how users get into the directory. So you need to come up with a workflow there. Considerations for how you're going to shape your guest access strategy. Who do you need to collaborate with and where, in what applications? That's going to determine whether you're just going to use SharePoint external access, whether you're going to look to group and team and Azure AD, B2B as the place that you add your guests. Who will help you understand how you can protect yourself using those allow versus deny list. How do you want to onboard new externals, right? This is all about what is your process for that. Again, Office 365 allows lots of capabilities for owners to invite new guests. If you open that up, you want to make sure that you've got your allow, deny domain lists set up if appropriate. No real good answer right now from Microsoft, at least outside of their new identity governance capabilities. For lifecycle of guests, this is right now a manual process, or building your own workflow or leveraging a third-party workflow like the one we have. But this is the biggest complaint I get today. Once guests are in, right, and if you think about the fact that, at least by default, that guest access in groups and teams is a giant on-off switch, which affects all groups and all teams. Once a user's in the directory, you have very little control about where they can be added. So getting users out of the directory when they're not needed anymore is a key concern for a lot of folks. Right now, either you're going to go third-party application, you're going to build your own workflow, or you're going to have some manual processes to review this. All right, let me pause there because I know we're getting up to time. Jeremy, thanks for not throwing the hat at me, or I didn't see any hook come out, so that's good. But we'll pause there for questions, comments. Hopefully this wasn't too complicated for everybody. I think it's useful to see how much wiring there is under the hood, though, for you to understand how you're going to shape your strategy. Questions, comments?
No, no questions. Wow, this is your shot.
No, this was really great because there are a lot of screens that seem to control sharing, but this was good, taking us all the way down the onion.
Cool. Good.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks for feedback for John.
I don't know which to hope for. I know that your product suite, I think, makes it easier to manage some of this, but it would be nice if Microsoft would also make it easier to manage.
Yeah, they do. I mean, they have, so to be completely fair, they have this that they've been rolling out here. It is a Azure AD P2 technology, this identity governance. What this is, it does give you a little bit more control. You can see here the license requirements. Two areas here, I'll just take you down real quickly. First, entitlement management and access reviews. Entitlement management, we could do a whole session, Jeremy, on this, probably down the road, but what this allows you to do is create what's called an access package. An access package is a predetermined set of sites, groups, teams, applications, right? I can create an access package and say, hey, these are the collaborative, objects that that are part of a project, and then I can give someone access to that package. They do have some pretty cool guest on and offboarding workflows here when it comes to access packages, but again, it means you need to go through the additional step of packaging predetermined groups, teams, sites, apps into these packages, and what you're actually controlling is access to the package, not necessarily the permissions in the groups, teams, and sites. Granting them access gives them access to the package initially, but from there all bets are off, right? When you revoke access to the package, obviously they revoke access to everything, and you do have some periodic reviews possible here. Access reviews are a little bit simpler. What they let you do is say on a periodic basis, I'm going to begin an access review of the members of that group and team. You can assign that to the owners of the group and team. Downside of the access reviews, they work really well for group membership and team membership. You can require that these access reviews only review guests so that it's not so cumbersome for the reviewer. The downside of these is because it's an Azure technology, this does not work for SharePoint sites, and even worse, it doesn't cover any of the SharePoint specific shared elements. So you'll be able to review the member of that team, but you'll have no idea what external sharing or guest access or sharing links exist in SharePoint outside of the team membership. So they're working on it. There's nothing yet that really does it top to bottom. And of course, the elevated license requirement.
All right, any other questions? All right, well, John, I wanted to thank you for coming today. This has been extremely helpful and unraveling of a very complicated subject. So we really appreciate your time and look forward to hearing from you again in the future.
Sounds good, Jeremy, anytime. And please feel free to reach out to me if anybody has questions after the session as things knock around in your head.